three different parts. The Roadmap to Zero program, which is responsible for developing various solutions and platform for the industry, and this including the Emission position paper. We have the Academy, which is a part of the organization that support the training, support capacity building, and finally we have the Implementation Hub, which is responsible for the scaling of adoption and implementation of innovative techniques. Within the Roadmap to Zero program, we are further subdivided into three main pillars. We have input, process, and output. So input are related to input chemistry. So currently we have the ZDHC MR cell. Process are related to the process control, health and safety, for example. And in that regard, we have the ZDHC Chemical Management System framework. And later this month, we will be launching the TIG, Technical Industry Guidance of the CMS. And finally, we have the segment of the output, and that is in relation to, the wastewater guideline, for example, as well as this document, the Emission position paper. Now, let's take a look on the development of this paper. The position paper was primarily developed by by the collaboration between the brands, the supply, and subject matter expert in this emission field. In this position paper, the program team had made comparison and benchmark against various regulation, regional and national regulation, as well as from organizations such as the World Health Organization, etc. So that we would basically have a starting point for this emission position paper. Why do we develop this position paper? So first of all, there are many regulations or differences in regulations between national requirements. The brands, each of them may have their own emission requirement. Various environmental stewardship program may have their own air emission program. So, all these different requirements and standards and regulations essentially leads to perhaps confusion between the suppliers. Well, what should I follow, or which one should I adopt? So to minimize confusions, to minimize the duplicative effort, the ZDHC program team conducted this alignment project where we aligned the air emission into single approach to address the potential adverse effects of the environment and the surrounding community when it comes to off-gas and when it comes to various emissions such as VOC, for example. At this moment in time, you might be quite curious, why do we call this document a position paper, unlike previous documents such as the wastewater guideline, where we call it as a guideline? The reason that we want to call this as a position paper is that we are aware that it will take some time for the industry to transition themselves, when it comes to tracking emission, understanding what processes that they may have within the supply chain or within the facility when it comes to air emission. So at this moment in time, we wanted to, release this document as a position paper, so that we give the opportunity for the textile, leather, and footwear supply to transition to monitoring the air emission and later, do some perhaps calculations and testing when it comes to emission of various chemical substances. But I want to hold this thought for one moment, and we'll come back to it later at the end of this call when we talk about what is expected of you in the future of the air emission program. So as we mentioned earlier, the program team and also the task team, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank the task team to collaborate with us. The task team and the program team essentially compare various international and national recommendations. This includes the WHO pollutant, globally regulated air pollutant, greenhouse gas, and the team has also taken into consideration of the ZDHC MRSL. And the aim of this paper is to enable the contributor and the entire supply chain to minimize air pollution and create a single online approach for air emission. And okay, now we come to the objective and the scope. Marielle, would you like to say a few words on this?
Yes, thank you, Phil. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar again, also from my side. So we are going to look at the scope of the air emissions position paper, looking at well as what is in scope as what is out scope, because for other webinars that we had and guidelines that we have, the scope is rather obvious, but in this case, of course, it's very process related. So we want to have a closer look at what is actually part of the air emission paper and what is not. Next slide, please. So first of all, looking a little bit more into these objectives of the position paper, where Phil already included some comments as well. So we want to establish required parameters and minimum tracking expected by facilities to ensure that air emissions do not have an adverse impact on communities and the environment. That is why this paper was brought primarily into life. And of course, with the paper itself, we would also like to share best practices. What could you do to optimize the work that you do in the supplier facility to release this and to make this impact lower. In the end, we also look at recommended limit values that we propose for quantitative testing, and that you will all see coming back later in the webinar when we cover these specific topics. And now let's have a look at the document scope, which is the next slide, please. The document scope is on all industrial air emission discharges produced from facilities operations and process operations associated with textile apparel and footwear suppliers. So it's not only facility operations, but also process operations, both together. And if we look a little bit closer into the scope, next slide, please, which is the scope of the facility operations, we will see that included within this scope is of the emissions is the boilers in the facility. So we will have a look at that. The generators, combustion engines, industrial ovens that are used for heating, drying, and curing in the facilities, combustion heating and ventilation, refrigerant-containing devices, other sources of known air emissions from the facility operations that are potentially not something that we can mention right now in more detail, but that you know of is being used in the facility, and other sources of volatile organic compounds. So all are included within the scope. Then next slide, please. What is included in the scope when it comes to process operations, which is of course very important for those on the call to know. When it comes to process operations, included are yarn spinning or synthetic fiber manufacturing, finishes, both mechanical and chemical finishes, solvents, adhesives and cementing, printing, dyeing, denture frames or other heating processes in the facility, spot cleaners, sprayed chemicals or paints, others, and of course other sources of known air emissions from production processes, such as ozone depleting substances and others in relation to that. Now, when we look at the facility operations, we made a small visual to make it more clear for everybody how this will, in the end, actually work. So you can see that within the factory, we have determined 3 areas within this scope. And when it comes to the in-scope emissions, we're looking at the point source emissions, which are pointed out in number 1 in the small visual, and the energy generating emissions from the boilers and the generators, who we all see in that first part of the visualization of this supplier facility. Then for the process operations, we also look at the point source emissions, but also the stack emissions, where we, for example, see the solvent exhaustion. And for process operations, we also have a look at the non-point source emissions and the fugitive emissions, so the unexhausted solvents. Then what is specifically out of scope? Which is maybe even more important for you to stay aware of in relation to what is in scope. Wastewater emission to air is not in scope of this position paper, nor is sludge emission to air. And also within the chemical manufacturing industry is not in scope, even though there's been discussions on the concepts in the position paper that may be relevant to the chemical manufacturing facilities. The whole position paper is not directed to that. So these 3 elements are not in scope of the position paper and will be left also out of this webinar itself. Now let's have a look at part of the content of the position paper. So we will dive into the high-level concepts of the position paper. We will, of course, not be able to go into every single detail. Therefore, of course, we refer to the Air Emissions position paper for you to have a look at and to go through that for yourself. And if you have any related questions, of course, come back to us with those questions so we can support you. But let's have a look at the high-level content of the paper, and also look at the key pollutant groups of concern. So in the facility operations, we set some key pollutant groups of concern that are included in the position paper and the scope of work. So we gathered from different sites information and did research on the key pollutant groups, and a part of that, the ones in column A of the World Health Organization, determines several pollutants that are important as groups to concern, which are nitrous oxides, particulate matter, ozone, and sulfur oxides. So these came out of the research that we did for the World Health Organization. Then we have globally regulated air pollutants that are part of within the scope. Those are the volatile organic compounds, the hazardous air pollution and toxic air pollutants, carbon monoxide and ammonia. And then, of course, we also took into account the greenhouse gases. Next slide, please. Now, in relation to the tracking, there is within the facility operations, we specified specific sources and types in relation to the tracking. And of course, we look at the permit of a facility. So are all pollutants listed within the permit of the facility that is operating? And is there also relevant compliance documentation that can be reviewed of that specific facility? When it comes to the operations itself, we want to make sure, and in this paper we also propose and underline that there should be an equipment inventory that we are able to review, that everybody is able to review, that there are fuel source data available, that the emission locations and types are determined, and that they are able to be located quite easily. That there's treatment methods for each point source. If there's numerous point sources there, and potential to emit and emissions calculations, plus if possible, testing for each point source whenever needed, so that all this is in place to make sure that there can be a proper tracking for the air emissions in a specific facility. Now, to the position paper, there's a 3-level approach, and it's all specified within the appendixes that are included in the air emissions. So if you've already seen the position paper is including several appendages that specify more on the pollutants. There's a foundational level with basic expectations for the facility to have a look at and to determine on how to evaluate them. There's a progressive level, and there's also an aspirational level when it comes to the performance, which is a best in class, and that really looks at the best practices in relations to air emissions and impact reduction in that. So facility operation pollutants can be reviewed in Appendix A, and specifically more in Table 1. Where you can also see the applicability of specific pollutants and the tracking of it. And then we also have the limit values that are in Appendix A, Table 1, that also include parameters and the limit values for the facilities that we just indicated as well from the WHO and the Global Regulated Air Pollutants list. Next slide, please. Oh, this is again.
Yeah, this is,
sorry, this is a repetition of, apologies.
Sorry.
It's a repetition of the previous slide. So just again to specify also for the process operations, we did the same. There has been done the same type of research or of what to include in the position paper, also for the process operations side. Here we, from the World Health Organization, the nitrous oxides, the particulate matter, the ozone and the sulfur oxides, again, are key pollutant groups of concern that we take into account. And from the globally regulated air pollutants, the volatile organic compounds, hazardous air pollutants and toxic air pollutants, carbon monoxide and ammonia are again taken into account. Same as with the facility operations. Key difference here is that we also have some other key parameters in the process operations that we take along, which is the ZDHC MRSL parameters, alongside with the greenhouse gases. So if we just indeed refer, back to the facility operations, there we only had the greenhouse gases as key pollutant groups of concern here. And with the process operations, we also include the ZDHC MRSL parameters. Next slide, please. Then also for the process operations, of course, in the air emissions paper, we stipulate points on the tracking. So in relation to the permits, again, we will want to make sure that all pollutants are listed within the permit of the facility and that the relevant compliance documentation is again there. For the process operations, we also want to take into account that there's a clear chemical inventory available, that potential to emit for each pollutant group is there, and if needed, emission calculation is available or can be done. That there's a tool and process inventory that can be reviewed to know what is being used in the facility. That there's local treatment or exhaust connections. That if applicable, there's process emission testing. And if applicable, there's industrial hygiene sampling. So all these tracking elements are also in the paper more extensively looked at and can be reviewed in more detail when reading the paper itself. Next slide, please. So looking at the future of air emissions, of course, this is a position paper, as Phil already clearly explained. So what will happen after this? Because this paper is actually preparing you for what is to be done in the future and what you can already have a look at the facility. So the position paper is preparing you already for ZDHC air emission guidelines. So here we already lay the basis of what is to come, which will be a first air emission guidelines version 1.0. So currently there is no need specifically to straight away do immediate actions on this paper. It is a paper to raise awareness of what will be needed in relation to air emissions and lowering the impact, to stay informed on the developments of the air emissions project. And we also, created the paper for you to have an opportunity to already do some self-assessment at your operations and your facility to see if you're ready for the next steps. So all those expectations are outlined in the paper, and with that you can prepare yourself. So it's laying the ground. It's the basis for the guideline. And during this year, ZDHC will work on developing streamlined reporting mechanisms, monitoring requirements, and testing that will allow the paper to transition into those ZDHC air emission guidelines. And the aim is for 2022 to develop and publish a full air emission guidelines. So that's next year. Then suppliers should continue to self-assess operations against the expectations outlined in the position paper and should prepare to implement the air emission guidelines in 2023. So there's a clear transition period where we give you the opportunity, of course, to slowly, roll into the matter, look at your own facility and self-assess to see where you are in relation to the air emission position paper to move towards the guidelines. And then in 2023, when the air emission guidelines have been launched the year before and you had time to digest them, the full implementation of the guideline will be starting. Now, if we stay with this slide, how can you prepare your facility for the future? Of course, this document, which is already detailed in several different ways, can be used to understand the gaps with your current air emission control efforts at the facility. So use it to indeed already do those first self-assessment steps to look at where you stand as a facility. Then you can already start as well, based on that information, to build robust inventories for instance, equipment, fuels, chemicals, tools, and processes. So that is the key part of the work to be done, to be able to include all this in your pre-work. So you will have that all prepared when the guideline starts to roll out. If you already have a clear idea of what is in your facility. And when necessary, you can already start to create improvement plans, considering the facility design, which is also included in the position paper. So these are first steps that you could start with, based on the position paper that will prepare your facility for the future and for the guideline that will be coming out in 2022. Now, with this, this is actually very high level and fast information on what the document actually contains. We are well aware that the document itself has a lot more information that can be reviewed by you yourself, within your own frame of time. But if you have any questions in relation to the air emission paper, we would like to open up the floor for those questions. So we have quite some sufficient time left. And of course, first of all, we would like to thank you for your attention, but we would also like to have the time to answer any questions that you have yourself on this position paper. So with that, we would like to open up the floor for those that have questions. And we will be here together with Prasad Pant, our regional director from India, who is also there to support us with answering the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariella. Just to let you know, currently we do not have any question in the Q&A. So if you do, please type it in and we will happy to answer the questions.
I think the first questions are now coming in.
Yeah.
I will have a look as well if Prasad is able to, as a panelist, to unmute.
I think we need to promote.
He cannot see the question. So what I will do is I can make sure to already share the question. So the first question that is coming in is from Rakesh from TÜV Rheinland. Thanks for this overview. Do you plan to have a slide clarification that shows how MMCF air emissions focuses on CS2 and H2S, whereas this position paper is more MRE broad? So I will share the question.
I think, Mario, we need to promote Prasad to the panelists.
Yes, I will go to the background. In the meantime, I've shared the question with Prasad, so he can already have a look at it.
I think I could answer another question from Rakesh in relation to whether ZDHC will have a similar process like wastewater to have a list of approved labs. So Rakesh, at this moment in time, we would want to focus the air emission in terms of tracking and calculation. So the reason that we mentioned tracking during the presentation is that it is important for the factory to develop their own inventory in terms of the chemistry input, in terms of the process that they use, and then the amount of fuel and energy that they use, and hopefully they could, do this calculation on their own. So it's more on a calculation and tracking base. At this moment in time, we are not sure whether we would be developing a process similar to the wastewater reporting. But yeah, we are looking more into a calculation side than testing in this instance.
Can I add to what you have said, Phil? That to answer Rakesh's, can you hear me?
I could hear you, Prasad.
Yeah. So to add to what Rakesh has asked, see the air emissions position paper is actually applied to the textile, apparel, and footwear industry, and not very specifically to the MMCF. The MMCF is a very specific document for air emissions that we have already published. So this particular position paper, as we are maintaining from the beginning, is for the textile, apparel, and footwear industries to start gearing up and evaluating their air emissions with respect to the general SOx, NOx parameters, as well as with the ZDHC, MRSL parameters. So I don't know whether we should really have any kind of a clarification slide comparing the MMCF air emissions with this position paper, because the target audience is totally different. The MMCF industry is different, and we have the textile, apparel, and footwear industry for which this position paper has been made. But of course, we will take this question to Carla also, and maybe give a final reply to Rakesh.
Sure, of course.
Then we have another question coming from Noor. How to segregate stack, air emission, and point source, as in the presentation you defined 2 different levels of this. So how to segregate stack emission and point source, as in the presentation you defined 2 different levels.
So Mariella, if you can go back to that slide where that diagram is there of the 3 positions from where the air emission will be monitored.
This one, Prasad?
Yeah. So Noor, this is basically where the 3 positions are there, where the air emissions are going to be measured. So one is your boilers and generators, from where you have energy generation as well as some other point source generations. Then you have process operations. So whether you have a stentor or whether you have solvents being used in your printing department, as well as the stack emissions from the chimneys of the factories. This is where you have the process operations or the point source emissions from the process operations. And the other are the non-point source. That means the accumulation or the fugitive emissions which are there due to the process operations. These may be unexhausted solvent emissions or some other kind of finishing applications that may be there in the facility. So I think this is where we have to focus these 3 points, where the point source as well as the stack emissions as well as the fugitive emissions could be possible from the factory.
Thank you, Prasad.
Thank you.
There's two questions I think that we can combine, which are related to the HIG. So we see Rakesh, and who also says the current position paper does not mention anything about the HIG. However, as we all know, air emissions is one of the 5 sections in the HIG. So how should we consider preferences, and how should we actually align this, with the ongoing HIG facility environmental module? So I'm shortly checking with Prasad. Is this something that we can answer right here, right now, or do we want Carla to come back on this topic?
No, we can answer this briefly, that the ZDHC air emissions is only a position paper. It is not yet a guideline to be implemented and measured. We are only trying to give a little bit of an advance indication as to what will be expected with respect to a facility implementing the ZDHC Roadmap to Zero program when it comes to measuring the chemicals emission into the air output. So I don't think we should right now get into comparing it with the HIG index or the HIG FEM module, because that is a totally different kind of evaluation methodology that we are talking about. Here we are just talking about an idea of what is to be expected with respect to air emissions for ZDHC. And we are not asking any kind of testing by the supplier as of now. We are just trying to make the facility aware that they can take into account what they are currently doing with respect to air emissions measurements and monitoring, and start preparing for these kind of expectations that will translate into a final guideline maybe by 2022. And I think that will answer Rakesh's another question, that will ZDHC have a similar process like Waste Proto to have a list of approved labs? I don't think we should get into that right now, because as I said, we are not yet got to a position where we can have, we can say that these are the guidelines and how these are going to be implemented at the supplier facility. So we will have to wait for a year or so for this to be worked out.
And Prasad, presumably in terms of question 4 from Rakesh on the sensor-based air quality monitoring, that would be further down the line, right? Because that is also in relation to.
It's very clear that we have said in the webinar that this is only a position paper of ZDHC. It is only giving an outline of the expectations of ZDHC, and we will still work on how to translate it into the guidelines, industry guidelines, as well as how to monitor and report against these guidelines. So this is something which will be worked out in this year.
Okay. And we also have a question from Rakesh, question 5. Apart from simply risk to human health and air pollution at all around the factory, consider adding references about non-compliances for product. Example, when TVOC measured at pots in Rotterdam and footwear blocked. So I assume, Rakesh, you're talking about a case in Rotterdam where, when the customer opened a container and there were lots of VOC inside the container, whether we should add that point into the air emission guideline.
Really speaking, the ZDHC Roadmap to Zero program is, the scope is totally the manufacturing facility, and we have not Even if you see our MRSL and our CMS TIG, we are not including anything about the product as of now. This might change in the future, but as of now, it is more focused on the manufacturing processes and the manufacturing facility with respect to chemical management. But yes, this point from Rakesh is something that can be considered in the future about the VOC emissions from a product or from a container. But this would be the future.
Okay, thank you. And we have a question for Melanie. And the question is, in the future guidelines, do you plan to develop more about the occupational air exposure? For example, how to test, for how long, how many worker, etc. I think at this point, I think Prasad had covered this question in the sense that this position paper is only a indication of what is to come in the future, but in terms of, let's say, testing or air quality monitoring, that will be further down the line as we develop the air emission guidelines. But yeah, we'll certainly take your point into consideration. Okay. So I think we have answered all the questions for now, but we still have roughly 10 minutes. So if you guys have more questions, please let us know and we'll answer them.
Yeah, and I would of course also like to indicate that what we will be doing is building a question list that we will be also based on the questions that you're asking us right now, that we could potentially answer in our knowledge base. So what we will do is that we will take all the questions that are coming in today, see what we need to explain a little bit more clearly when it comes to the usage of this paper and why it's been brought into life, so that at all times you can have a look at that as well, or explain that to the facility, that those questions are ready for you to be answered. So we will be taking up all these good questions from your side, and also take them back to the team to make sure that we have a clear overview of the questions and answers that are coming out of the field. And then maybe one more operational word during that you might reflect on if you still have another question. The webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded in the ZDHC Academy for everybody's reference tomorrow. So if you would like a colleague or yourself as well to review again the webinar and the introduction of the position paper, then you can always go to the ZDHC Academy. It's academy.roadmaptozero.com and review it in the webinar section again. And the webinar section is free, publicly available, so you can always also direct your colleagues to that could not potentially be on this call. So do take into account that it will be uploaded after today, and you can always reference to the webinar if you wish.
Okay. think with that in mind, and I do not see any further questions as of now. We'll give you 10 minutes back of your day. And, thank you for attending this webinar. And if you have further questions, please let us know, and we'll try our best to answer your questions.
Yep. And I would propose, if you have any questions, to first sending them, in this case, to training@zdhc.org. So training@zdhc.org. And then we will be able to share those questions with the relevant people within the team.
Okay.
Thank you very much for joining us today. And have a nice day, evening ahead of you. Thank you very much.